Okay. I propose that we get started. Can everybody hear me? Which, of course, is a stupid question, because if somebody can't hear me, he won't respond. But I assume that everybody can. Well, I would like to welcome you also on behalf of Paul de Guchteren, who's sitting next to me, to this session. This session is about migration as one of these themes on which sociological or social scientific work takes place. It's clear that migration is high on the political agenda. Migration is a topic that's debated all over the place. We know that in a number of countries, governments have lost power because they sort of ignored or were regarded to ignore migration issues. We also know that in other countries, or maybe even the same country, political parties can gain a tremendous number of votes by playing the migration card. And those two instances tell us a lot about the social significance of migration. Just open a newspaper or look at the radio on the television or go to a bar or to a cab and talk, and you know that you will undoubtedly notice that migration is very topical. Is that justified? Well, yes and no. It depends on how you look at it. It may not be justified in the light of the fact that the vast majority of the world population is not a migrant. 97 to 98% of the population just stays put. They don't migrate. They just stay in the country where they are. Of course, that also means that 2 to 3% of the world population is on the move. And together, that's quite a lot of people. And we also know that those people are not equally spread all over the world. A number of people move to particular locations, and the consequences there are very visible and palpable. Migration, of course, affects various institutions, the family, communities in the first place, but also, say, the economy. The guest worker system, as we knew it in Europe, the Bracero program, as was known in the United States. The programs in a number of countries to attract high-skilled professionals are institutionalized because they are supposed to fulfill economic needs. There's an emergence of all sorts of new industries. In many countries, there are restrictive migration regimes. As a consequence of that, a new industry of trafficking and smuggling is developing, and quite a lot of money is going on in those industries. There's also the border industry. The United States has been building a fence, quite a long fence. In other countries, the military or other paramilitary forces are mobilized to control migration. Well, here too, that is an enormous, economic but also political implication. The integration industry, all these bureaus, schools offering courses and training programs to people who have migrated and now want to learn the language of the country in which they live. There are these institutions that train professionals how to deal with immigrant ethnic minorities. There are all sorts of service providers in the welfare sector, in the health sector, and so on and so forth. And they all testify to all sorts of implications that migration have. And then, of course, there's the knowledge industry, of which at least I and some of you might be part of. We study migration, we study the consequences of migration. Perhaps some of us study other topics, but you hit upon migration topics. We produce our knowledge, get engaged with our peers, with the public, with the political institutions, and in so doing play our role. And then finally, migration has created, or at least has given the incentive to create a whole series of bureaucratic structures, notably at the local or national level, but increasingly also at the international level. Well, of course, this list is not complete, but they all show that it's a relevant topic. It's a very complex topic, and a number of aspects of those topics are on the agenda today. Well, unfortunately, one of the speakers, he was unable to come. And that's the first, well, the one who was intended as the first speaker, Bino Hadria from New Delhi. He can't come. But fortunately, a number of other speakers have shown up. We haven't seen David Ingleby, so we are actually hoping that he is still sort of around this complex building someplace and that he pop up momentarily. If not, then we are very happy to have the presentations of those who did show up. The format of this meeting will be very simple. There will be a presentation, first by Nicola Piper and then by Joseph Gami. Those presentations will be followed by a short Q&A, just technical questions. Then we move to the other speaker. And thereafter, there will be plenty of time for discussions on a number of topics. And I really would like to invite you to reflect on, of course, what has been said, also on the research policy nexus that's consequent of it, and perhaps also a bit about the possible research agenda that may emerge out of this. Well, before giving the floor to Nicola Piper, I would pass the word to Paul de Guchteren, because he wants to say a few things about the role of UNESCO in this field.
Thank you very much. As Jan said, my name is, my compatriot says, my name is Paul de Guchteren. I work at UNESCO. I'm heading the International Migration Research Program at UNESCO, which is a program executed in all regions in the world, many different field offices, creating networks of researchers in those regions that we work. Why is UNESCO interested in migration? I think it's more or less the same question as why should we as social scientists be interested in migration? Jan already alluded to some of the issues which are presented as problems. Migration as a problem, migration as an issue, a hot topic in the media, a hot topic in politics as well. I think that's a very valid observation. On the other hand, I would like to supplement that notion of migration as a problem with the notion of migration as an opportunity, a challenge, so to say. I think that is the major issue that UNESCO wants to contribute to the research on migration. Try to find ways how research can contribute to solving problems rather than describing them merely and telling us how bad it is. For that purpose, we connect closely with many governments who are interested in getting advice on policy related to migration. When I was a younger social scientist, my dream was often that a prime minister or whoever would call me and say, we need you, we need to solve a problem. That never happened when I was working in the Academy of Sciences or when I was working later in a data archive. But it does happen now when I'm working at UNESCO. We do have governments that seek advice. We do have governments that present their problem and that want to advance on issues such as xenophobia, the treatment of migrants, migrant rights, issues of the problems with migrants trying to find a positive way out to balance social cohesion with cultural diversity, for instance, one of the main priorities of UNESCO, but also to look at the issue of education. Many governments see their young people move for study purposes, and this is generally considered as a brain drain, especially in those smaller developing countries. Is a problem. And they approach UNESCO to find ways to solve this. I'm not saying that we have those ways, at least we have some conventions and declarations that deal with that, for instance on the recognition of diplomas worldwide, so that at least when they move, they don't lose their already acquired information, formation there, acquired education. Anyway, briefly, I'm not going to talk too much on UNESCO. If we have time, we can allude to a few of our priorities at the moment. So I would like to introduce the first speaker. By the way, Mr. Kadria, he is one of the victims, unfortunately not in literary sense, of the flu virus scare. He's had problem in terms of quarantine in New Delhi airport, so he couldn't make it to come to Bergen. So the first speaker will be Nicola Pipers. He's currently senior lecturer and associate director of the Centre for Migration Policy Research in Swansea University, Wales, UK. I know her since long as a migrating academic. We've worked with her for many years, especially in the Asian region, when she worked in Singapore, Australia, I think Geneva as well, Copenhagen. She's editor of a book which is available actually in this building on new perspectives on gender and migration rights, entitlements and livelihoods. It's with UNRIST. And she's the author of several other papers dealing with both the Asian region and gender issues on migration as well. So Nicola, you have the floor.
Thanks, Paul, for the kind introduction. I thought, by way of introduction, I thought I would like to start and say a few words about the two major broad themes which currently dominate the global policy debate on migration. The first one is the so-called governance of migration. And this really revolves around what has been termed the management of migration, which is concerned with the coordination and designing of emigration and immigration policies. And it really points to the fact that finally on the global policy level, migration has been recognized as, well, we've just heard, not just as a problem, but actually as something which is pretty normal. It's normal, it's here to stay, and somehow we have to deal with it. And the whole idea behind this management is, is to try and work out, what kind of policies could maximize the benefits of migration, ideally to everyone who is involved. And this is, of course, quite a challenging undertaking. And the second global policy theme is the relationship between migration and development, which is as such actually not a new concern at all. It's been around for at least 3 or 4 decades. But the current phase of this debate of this particular debate focuses on remittance-led development, whereby migrants, the individual migrants, are crafted as agents of development. And here, it's quite what has happened quite extensively is the reaching out by particular governments in the south to diasporas abroad, and obviously trying to create opportunities for remittances, return migration, and so forth. And the implications of these processes are rarely the same for men and women. They tend to have gendered outcomes, and I'll explain more about this in a minute. The interesting thing is it's not only different outcomes, between men and women, but also between different kind of migrating women, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute. Now, with regard to policies by destination countries, we can observe some degree of convergence, so very, very broadly speaking, between them. The first is what we can observe is a global hunt for highly skilled migrants, and this is all part of the build-up of a knowledge economy. And the seeking of a particularly very highly skilled type of migrant. The second is the expansion of temporary contract migration schemes, which we used to see, in the 70s, but now it's all coming back. And this to the expense, really, of permanent schemes. And this involves skilled as well as lesser skilled migrants. So, for example, in Europe, doctors and nurses from outside the European Union are often offered time-limited contracts rather than permanent residence permits. This also There's also an increasing, there are also increasing restrictions on lower skilled migration and very little access to legal migration schemes, despite the need for many of such so-called lower skilled migrants in certain sectors in many destination countries. And partly as a result of these restrictions, we can observe a rise in so-called undocumented or irregular migration, which, you know, in the popular media is often referred to as illegal. And women are present in all of these streams, the highly skilled as well as the lower skilled. But there are important gender differences in terms of mode of entry, type of job, access to entitlements and rights, and also simply overall numbers. Now, in the poorer countries of origin, the major push factors have been identified by the Global Commission on International Migration in its report from 2005 along the lines of the 3 Ds. So there's demography, so we have a younger population in the global south in the need of employment, and also, you know, there are rising aspirations, so there's, you know, a strong demographic push factor to leave. The second D refers to democracy, or rather the lack thereof, but not actually only in terms of good governance and institutional issues, but also in terms of a broader sense of democracy, you know, democratization of human relations, and gender issues fall under this actually as well. And the third D refers to development, and again, the lack of, for example, local employment opportunities. But again, this also points to broader development beyond the economic realm, you know, including also broader social developmental issues. Now to come to the feminization of international migration. Now, researchers and policymakers have now widely acknowledged and accepted the increasing participation of women as being one of the key features of migration today. It actually has been a key feature for, you know, many decades, but again, it's taken a while to finally, you know, acknowledge this widely. So in total, the official figure we see by the UN is in total women make up 49.6, so almost 50% of global migration flows today. But in specific country contexts, the percentage is actually much higher. So for example, the Philippines, the annual rate of newly hired migrants is 70% of those are women. Sri Lanka, 65%. And in Indonesia, 75. And I have to point again, this is so-called legal migrants, so those who show up in statistics. Now, the rise in women's presence in all migration streams it's largely due to men's inability to find, in the parlance of the ILO, decent work at home, and also actually lacking opportunities abroad, like, you know, big construction schemes coming to an end. So men finding, you know, less opportunities to find work, so women have to chip in. And then also on the demand side, an increasing demand in so-called feminized sectors or employment in destination countries. Now, just to show you a figure in terms of the changes in the feminization of women between 1960 and 2005. Now you can see it hasn't actually been such a drastic difference, not just, you know, not an extremely drastic increase. And there are only 2 regions in this world where where women actually are not in higher numbers migrating, and this is South Asia and North Africa. And again, plenty of reasons, socio-cultural, you know, to do with women's constrained mobility and so forth. Now, migrant women are, generally speaking, overrepresented in exactly the same sectors or employment categories in which we see home state or, you know, local women overrepresented. And this is basically what we social scientists refer to as reproductive labor, or, you know, in the service sector, in the care sector. And what this usually means that on average, these you know, jobs are worse paid, the conditions are worse. But also we can observe more women migrating to manufacturing sectors in so-called middle-income countries. So we have Bolivian women in Argentina, Burmese women in Thailand, Bangladeshi women in Malaysia working in textile companies, especially in small and medium-sized companies. And in the rich countries, you know, those who are classified as low-skilled work, you know, in agriculture, food processing, sweatshops, and all sorts of service sector related jobs, cleaning and so forth. Now another phenomenon we can observe is what has been termed replacement migration, which really pertains sort of a little bit to the race to the bottom, in that when an international, it sort of pertains to this example of an international migrant migrating to, for example, the global north, and then being replaced by someone who comes maybe from the neighbor country or from a country that is sort of, in this ranking system, poorer. So, for example, what we see is a South African nurse going to the UK, being replaced by a Zimbabwean nurse, or we see a Polish nurse going to Sweden, replaced by a Moldovan, or we have a Filipino domestic worker migrating to Hong Kong, Singapore, or Italy. And she then pays for a Filipino, maybe internal migrant, a woman who cannot afford migrating international or doesn't have the human and social capital to do so. What we can observe is then not only an international gender division of reproductive labor, but also a stratified system based on skill, human and social capital, which creates a hierarchy then even among internationally migrating women. So again, if your human and social capital is higher, then you can sort of make it, to the global north, so to speak. Now, in terms of skill distribution, as already said, women are actually present in all migration streams, and those classified as lower skilled as well as highly skilled. But the most recent OECD report, or the one from 2007, might have been another one in the meanwhile, on skilled migration, which is usually a phenomenon which is analyzed through the lens of brain drain in terms of the effects this migration has on the origin countries. So this report concluded that women are in fact overrepresented in the brain drain. But what we need to do here is we need to break this down by gender, and then when we do so, what appears is women migrate into specific job categories, and one of those is nursing and the caring professions. Now, 90% of foreign nurses are women, so they do not migrate like the highly skilled men into ICT, business, and financing. But most of the so-called highly skilled women are actually in the nursing profession. And the other thing which is actually not captured by official statistics is the fact that many highly skilled women often migrate as part of family unification schemes. And they don't appear at all in these official statistics. Now, this just to show you actually, again, to see, how the OECD report is actually a little bit skewed. Because in actual facts, when we look at these statistics, the one and single most dominant legal migration channel for women is domestic work. So we see most of the internationally migrating women actually end up working in domestic or household related, or as caregivers, which is sort of a bit different from nursing. Inside caregiving is often in elderly people's homes, or also at home, looking after children or elderly people. So this is the one most dominating legal channel for women to migrate. So in other words, well, it is true that more migrant women today hold better positions than before, but they still remain a minority. And the majority of even the highly educated migrant women are likely to remain employed in the low-paid service sectors, often even in domestic and care, in the domestic and care sector. And they often cannot actually get the kind of jobs they were originally trained for, which is, by the way, also a problem a lot of migrant men are facing. And this is due to non-recognition of their qualifications, and then this leads to what's usually called de-skilling or brain waste. Now, in terms of, so based on what I've said so far, I would sort of like to propose on the conceptual and empirical level that what one really ought to maybe establish is a link between the three types of feminizations which have been written about in the literature, but quite most of the time treated separately. So one would be the feminization of work, generally speaking, the feminization of migration, and also the feminization of poverty. And the feminization of work and poverty can be related to men's out-migration and women being then left behind and then relegated to farm work and the kind of work the men did before, and they just now have to do everything basically. Or these two feminizations of work and poverty can also be linked to women's out-migration when they then become the main income earner but are burdened with increased responsibility to secure the family's income. And there's actually a lot of empirical evidence which shows that men left behind do not actually take on many of the domestic and child-rearing responsibilities. They leave it then to other women in the household and basically end up doing nothing. And the other thing is there's a lot of evidence pointing to migrant women remitting larger proportions of their income. But what this now means then for their own state of well-being, we don't really know much about this at all. Now, in terms of the conceptualizations of gendered migration in the academic literature, feminist theorists have for long critiqued the dominant focus on structural issues in many social science disciplines, because structure usually appears gender neutral, but are in fact not so when we account for women's experience and their agency. And migration research has been criticized for exactly the same, on exactly the same grounds. And so the argument has been made more recently that what we need is a more integrated approach, or integrated approaches which link individual agency with economic, social, and political structures across space and time. And the three sort of slightly more recent theorizations which have offered such integrated approaches, one, the transnationalism, which has been, by these two authors, they were basically more or less the first one who've done a gender critique and offered gender perspectives on transnationalism. Structuration theory, but here we still need a gender analysis. And then Saskia Sassens, and we are fortunate to hear her tomorrow, her Circuits of Globalization, where she very much introduced gender into it. So what these approaches point to is really the diversity of circuits and the complex stratification based on class, gender, race, ethnicity, human capital and social capital. And important also, the circulation is not only south-northbound, but also south-to-south. Now, another very important concept which highlights sort of the overwhelming presence of migrant women in reproductive work, and more importantly, domestic and the caring sector, is the global care chain concept. Now, this concept is usually defined as a series of personal links between people across the globe based on the paid or unpaid work or caring. And this concept is typically related to domestic and household workers, and also, but to a lesser extent, to care workers and nurses. And this has quite different implications as to whether we look at the origin or the destination country with regard to the nature of the care deficits, who the care provider is, and who the care recipient. Now, by way of conclusion, just to come back again to the idea of the three feminizations and how we could bridge them, is really when we this is actually the wrong slide. This was not meant to be bridged by networks, but bridged by chains. Because what I was trying to point out here is when we look at the literature on feminization of work, we find a lot of literature has been produced on the so-called global production, global commodity chains. And when we look at the feminization of migration, we have the global care chain concept, and the feminization of poverty. Here we have the global value care chain, global value chain, and I wanted to then say it would also be interesting then to relate this to global justice movements and how combining the three could actually inform the transnational social movements at the same time. So it's the chair metaphor really, which would allow us to establish a link between these three different types of feminizations, and also a link between internal and international migration and also help us to link how this can be translated into political activism, which is sort of a pet topic of mine, but I didn't decide to put this into this talk. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Well, thanks also for minding the time. Those who have very short questions are invited to raise them now. We will have a longer period for Q&A later, but if there's an urgent question, please come to the floor. There's a mic over here. Yes, please. Now, could you identify yourself? And please don't fall.
So I'm Leszek Kosiński, former Secretary General of ISSC, but this has nothing to do with my interest in migration, which was my previous research interest. My question is, or comment perhaps also, that in talking about migrant men, it's more reasonable to talk about them as individuals, as not members of family. Whereas you talk about women, it's more difficult to separate them from the family and from the children in particular. And the migration of women, who are mostly young women in reproductive age, are either young mothers or mothers-to-be, and it has an impact on the family. And has, well, if women migrate and leave children behind, it's more serious for the children, for family formation, for the whole process of psychological growth of children than when the father migrates. Now, it's even worse when the mother migrates, father migrates, and children are left either at the mercy of other family members or at the mercy of institutions. This is what is happening, for example, in Poland, that increasingly some institutions are faced with children abandoned, really. Mother says, well, she will return one day, but one day is further away and away and away. So the question is, would it make sense to link migration of women and feminization with the study of impact on family formation and family welfare? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. In actual fact, there is an awful lot of research being done on exactly this problem or phenomenon. In Asia, Latin America, Europe, I'm not so sure, on this whole phenomenon of so-called, left behind children. And what is also a few quite critical work has also been done recently in terms of how women who migrate and leave children behind are then also being almost blamed for the problems behind in terms of what happens to the children, rather than they are also being a little bit more focused on the little role the husbands are playing in all of this. So we have to be a little bit careful here. I mean, it's definitely a problem when both parents leave and the children are left behind either completely by themselves or in the care of an elderly grandparent. But I'm always kind of feel a little bit uneasy when people straight away say, so the women migrate and the children then suffer. Of course, there is a certain suffering, but all the research from the 70s on, particularly, it's a shame our Indian colleague isn't here, on the so-called Gulf wives where, in India, in the south of India, where a large number of men migrated to the Gulf states and left the women behind. This research has actually shown those women also, it was a tough time in terms of psychologically having to cope by themselves, and it also had a certain impact on children. It's just nobody actually really looked at the impact on children because it was assumed when the mother is left behind, then everything is fine. Now, with the feminization of migration, now the lens is suddenly on the children left behind, and research suddenly shows, oh well, the kids suffer. But in actual fact, research has been done in the Philippines on both, testing children's feelings about, when the mother leaves and when the father leaves. And it's actually quite similar. The only problem, the only difference is, yes, in many ways they do miss their mother more, but this is because the fathers don't take any role in the upbringing of their children. You know, they just go and gamble, or well, sadly, yes, and actually are not taking, you know, the role as a parent. So it is a problem, but how we go about it is a different story.
Yes, please. Could you please identify yourself and keep the questions short, please?
Oh, sorry.
Answer to.
Lydia Potts, University of Oldenburg in Germany. If we look at gender and migration and we then look at feminization, isn't that just half the topic? And men and masculinity and migration, it has briefly been addressed here, but I think in a rather stereotypical way. And isn't that really the research gap that we need to address?
Okay.
Of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, gender and feminization of migration. It's just, in many ways, it still is the case that, you know, the role of women, it has been recognized much more, but it still is the case that we have to hone this in more, and maybe even not so much here in destination countries, but in origin countries, you know, the contribution, and so on, even in terms of statistics. You know, I mean, there's still many gaps, but you are right.
Okay, but a very short question. Well, thank you.
Maurice Maras, I am an historian, and I would add only 2 or 3 points. First, now you are looking.
One short question.
No, you're looking to the present. We have 5 centuries of research of history of migration, and you cannot look to the past, to the present, without looking to the past for all the problems we have been talking about. Then the second question: migration is an investment, and I did not see the word investment. Who is paying for the migration of your women?
10 seconds.
Well, again, in terms of historically, yeah, well, that's something, you know, as sociologists, you know, when we think historically, it's 20 or 30 years. That is true. I mean, this is something that, yes. Now, in terms of investment, I just say, when it comes to these sort of things, and I was also earlier talking about social development, it's the social costs of migration I'm personally more interested in. So it's not so much the investment per se, it's the social costs and how we measure that. It's a different story.
Thank you very much, Nicola.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor David Ingleby, who is providing us with the perspective from a psychologist. He started professional work in the Medical Research Council in London, taught at the Cambridge University, but then moved to the Netherlands, Utrecht University, to eventually become professor of intercultural psychology. He works within ERCOMER, the European Research Center on Migration and Ethnic Relations, and he's particularly concerned with migrants' health. I think it's a very useful connection to the previous speaker. Finally, let me tell you, he's also consultant to the Council of Europe's Expert Committee on Mobility, Migration and Access to Healthcare, a body which is perfectly fitting the description of the general undertone of this meeting, how research can contribute to policy making. You have the floor.
Very much, Paul. I'm going to talk about the field of migration and health. I want to try and show you what an interesting and important research area it is, although in some ways it's still in its infancy. My own work has focused mainly on the European situation, but in fact the same issues crop up in all parts of the world where migrants are found, so it's a truly global topic. This is a picture of Utrecht, where I happen to come from. As Paul mentioned, I'm not really Dutch. I've lived there for 27 years, but I came originally from England, and like the previous speaker, I'm a migrating academic. And I've noticed a large number of people in migrant studies have the same background. It gives one a certain interest in the topic. I should also say I'm not, at least the psychologists don't regard me as a psychologist anymore, because I've been contaminated by sociology and anthropology and things like that. It's an interdisciplinary field, and my own work is very much interdisciplinary. So just to outline what I want to talk about, the first topic, the first question I'll answer is what is causing this enormous increase in work on migrant health? Because there has been a huge growth of activities, publications and policy reports in the last 10 years. So what's behind that? Secondly, what are the main topics? Well, I mentioned the basic ones here. One concern is with the state of health of migrants, and the other is with their ability to get good health care. Finally, I'll mention a couple of projects financed by the EU, which I'm involved in, which are concerned with getting people together who are working on these topics. So the first question is, what is causing the current explosion of interest? Well, as the following pictures show, there was already a very lively interest in migrant health 100 years ago, but it was a bit one-sided. The idea was to protect the population against infectious diseases. This is medical examination in Ellis Island. A pretty terrifying moment for arriving refugees because, of course, you could be sent back. If this gentleman found something under your eyelids, signs of trachoma, for example, you would be sent back. And so whole families were sometimes torn apart at this point. They had to make this agonizing decision. If one of the children was discovered to have something, would everybody stay? Would everybody go back? Would just the child go back? Pretty traumatic situation, as you can imagine. The present interest is much wider than that, and it focuses on all aspects of health, and it's not just concerned with protecting the host population, but also protecting the health of migrants. But my question was, where is this interest coming from? Why are people suddenly starting to work on it? Well, the most obvious answer is this picture, which is the recent rise in international migration. As you probably know, 200 million people in the world today are migrants, 3% of the population. That represents a threefold interest over the last 50 years. And that's not even taking account of their children, the descendants of migrants who also have health needs. But that isn't the only factor. That's a very important one. The other factor has to do with the meaning of health itself. Of course, in all human cultures, in all times, the fear of illness and death has been a major preoccupation. But it's especially strong, the preoccupation is especially strong in modernized countries, industrialized countries. What modernization does is to change the way people respond to this fear. Traditionally, one would pray, one would conduct rituals, hope to get better, because there wasn't much you could do about illnesses. Nowadays there is, and so people spend more and more money on healthcare, which may not be much more effective than the prayer and the rituals, but they still do it anyway. As witnessed the next slide, the USA is perhaps the most notorious case of vast amounts of money being spent on healthcare. Here you see the expenditure, even adjusted for inflation, has increased by a factor of 8 in the last 50 years. Now, some of that increase is due to the notoriously inefficient American system of healthcare delivery, but it's the same story in many other Western countries. Not only have these countries got much richer in the last 50 years, but they're spending a higher proportion of their money on healthcare. And as a consequence, the gap between the healthcare expenditure in rich and poor countries has got wider and wider. And, this is the USA. I've taken USA expenditure as 100. This is the current rate. Actually, it's 2006. But, you see the European countries are about half the American level. take, this is actually Afghanistan, but it could be Africa, any country in Africa except...
David, could you speak in the...
Yeah, any country in Africa except for, oh, there's probably a nice little, yeah, that's Afghanistan. But it could be Africa, because there too the expenditure is about 1% of the American level. India, Morocco, China, Turkey, and then you get up to the European level. So you see huge inequalities. And this is going to be the topic of Sir Michael Marmot's session tomorrow afternoon. And it's become a very hot topic in not just development studies, but also inequities within countries have suddenly become very prominent. However, I'm not concerned so much with the amount of money that's being spent, but what does it mean that it's being spent? Now, clearly health has become a major preoccupation in Western countries. We are all health freaks today. And there's been a huge expansion of the concept of health. For a start, more conditions are regarded as needing treatment. If you go into certain school classes these days with teenagers, all the children are wearing braces for their teeth. All of them have been diagnosed as having orthodontic problems. In my day, nobody had those things. Today, there's something strange about a child who doesn't in certain areas. But we've also broadened the concept of health. We include a lot more things in it than we used to. I illustrate that with this prism concerned with problem construction. The difficulties are complex, but they can be split up. They can be analyzed into religious, moral, political, social, psychological, or medical dimensions. And what we do in the West is spend more and more time on these dimensions, psychological and medical. In fact, we've invented words, psychologization, medicalization. So a lot of things that used to be regarded as in other ways are now seen as health issues. So these are the two things that are driving the interest in migrant health. The huge increase in migration and health, the two topics. Now, in the rest of my talk, I want to describe the main issues and viewpoints in this area. It's not just concerned with collecting facts, of course, the work in this area. It's informed by different frameworks or perspectives. No. I can use the, yeah.
It's on.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's good. No?
Yeah, and you just
Yeah, that's where
use
I
the
am.
mouse.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
Mhm.
okay. Now, we saw already the classical approach, the Ellis Island approach. This tends to be regarded as a very old-fashioned approach, but unfortunately, it's coming back these days because there are global epidemics, or there have been recently, of TB and hepatitis and HIV/AIDS. So screening of migrants has become important again. However, it's not these days used very much to exclude migrants. In France, it even provides grounds for giving migrants permission to stay in the country. But it is an important approach. The most recent approach is a health equity approach, which has three basic aspects. Health is regarded as a fundamental human right, ill health as an indicator of disadvantage, and adequate health care is also seen as a basic right. That is much more recent, and as you see, it's much more idealistic, sometimes a little bit too idealistic because governments refuse to apply it. But the third approach is the most common approach, that is from the discipline of public health, and it combines elements of both, protection of the population and a right to health approach. But it's more pragmatic. It's concerned mostly with reducing costs, increasing productivity, and so on. So these are the basic approaches. Now, as I mentioned, there are two main themes, state of health and entitlement to healthcare. And you can see these themes reflected. This is a quotation from a speech by the Director General of the World Health Organization at a conference, which shows how important the topic has become. There was a presidential conference on health and migration in the EU in Lisbon. What are the special needs of migrants who leave their homes? Are their needs being met? What is our collective duty in responding to these needs? So there you see the two themes. What are the needs and how should they be met? Well, if we talk about the first one, the state of health, what are the health needs? The only generalization you can make about this is that no generalizations can be made. You can't even say very definitely if migrant health is better or worse than other people's. On the one hand, there are some positive differences. There is a thing called the healthy migrant effect, which has been known for a long time, simply because young migrants tend to be younger and fitter, and they also sometimes have advantages in terms of lifestyle and diet. So sometimes migrants have positive health differences, but in most cases it's correct to regard them as vulnerable groups. However, you can't, like I said, you can't generalize. It depends on the group. It depends on the medical conditions you're talking about. It depends on whether it's first or second generation migrants. And last but not least, whether you're talking about men or women. However, I'll just give a quick run through on some findings. Perceived state of health is generally worse. Migrants tend to say they don't feel so healthy as other people. A large amount of that is explained by socioeconomic position, and in fact many health differences among migrants can be explained in that way, many but not all. Perinatal morbidity is another big problem in some groups, probably due to prenatal care not reaching mothers. And of course, migrants are getting older in some parts of Europe, and they're getting the diseases that are associated with old age, and in some cases, they're getting more of them, getting them higher levels. Cancer is higher for some forms of cancer, but much lower for other forms. Communicable diseases we talked about, TB, HIV, AIDS, hepatitis, they all tend to be high in some groups. Mental health problems is a controversial one because many migrants are not used to constructing their problems in terms of mental illness. I talked about psychologization and medicalization. That means that diagnosing migrants in terms of Western mental illness categories is sometimes not a valid activity. I'll return to that topic in the end. With asylum seekers, you can certainly say they tend to be unhappy and stressed. There used to be a cliche to say, well, they've been traumatized by their experiences in their home countries, but people are realizing more and more that they are stressed and depressed because of the way they're treated, because they have to go into a sort of parking place for many years in some cases. Their lives have to be put on hold, The most humane thing to do would be to put them into a deep freeze, and many governments would love to do that while their claims are being processed. And I'm sure when the technology is developed, many governments will do it. But, 3 minutes. Okay. Now, entitlement is a very complex concept. You first of all have to know what you're entitled to, and of course everybody else in the system has to know it. There are specific problems in countries where health insurance is important. People who are not employed, migrants who are not employed, sometimes miss out. Even if you have a national health service, they may have to pay in contributions themselves. Asylum seekers and irregular migrants have special barriers. Now, the last one's a hot potato, of course. Accessibility of services, how easy the services are to reach. Okay. The language barrier is very important. The information has to be given in people's own languages, and people have to trust the services. Secondly, what happens when you get to the consultation? Well, again, language barriers. Where you have migrants, you must have interpreter services available. Cultural competence, well, I don't have time to go into that, but it's a very important notion in this field. And sometimes you need to adapt the help given, but the whole issue arises, should you change the users or should you change the services? Again, I don't have time to go into that, but mental health is a case in point. Should you persuade people that they're really suffering from one of these? For example, this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Illnesses. See how the number of possible diagnoses has increased over the years. Now, should you persuade migrants that they're suffering from one of these 400 conditions, or should you think again about what we're doing in the West by psychologizing so many problems? Okay, I'll be as quick as I can. My last topic is the increasing European interest. Now, obviously, the interest is related to the amount of experience countries have with immigration. And these are the oldest immigration countries in Europe. The Netherlands and Sweden have a very strong traditional interest. Britain and Switzerland too. Now then you have a phase of migration in the 80s and 90s. And here it's actually Portugal, Spain and Norway who have cultivated a special interest in the topic. Then you have the most recent countries that have experienced immigration, and they're just beginning. But even so, Ireland took some very progressive policy decisions. And what this shows is countries like Spain, Portugal, and Ireland have learned from the experience of the red countries, if you like, and are introducing policies much quicker than they used to. Here you see how the comparative European reports have gone up, well, actually exponentially in the last 15 years. And this has to do with the efforts of the EU to try to coordinate and harmonize this work, to synthesize it. That is the aim of these two projects. MigHealthNet is trying to make the knowledge in different European countries accessible. And these are the countries where we have partners. You can see they're in the old countries and the new countries. And it has 17 countries. We're trying to extend it to the whole of Europe. It's a series of websites which collect information on all the different aspects of migrant health. They're all in the local language, so this is the Bulgarian website, but we use, this is not very accessible for me, but if we use Google Translate, we can turn that page into this page, and I can suddenly read it. Bulgarian legislation does not provide a definition of the term migrant, so you can see it's a very powerful tool, machine translation. The other, this is my last comment, the other action I'm involved in is the cost action, which is actually much larger, 30 countries, nearly 100 people. And it's a kind of think tank which is trying to bring people together and link up existing networks, because one of the things that plagues this area is what we call reinventing the wheel. People in a country will spend years and years, spend a lot of money discovering something which has been known for a very long time in some other corner of Europe. And if only they had been told before, they wouldn't have had to do it. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your patience.
Let's collect a few short questions.
Yeah.
No questions? Okay, then we move on. Maybe
Okay.
we'll come back
Thank
to
you.
it. Yeah.
Our next speaker is Joseph Shami. He's currently research director of the Center of Migration Studies in New York, Joe, I think?
Yes.
And editor of the journal International Migration Review. Of course, I know him much better, and people may know him much better, as the former director of the UN Population Division. Some of the slides that you actually saw in the previous presentations are from that population division, if I have it correctly. And he has been Deputy Secretary General of the landmark 1994 Cairo Conference on Population and Development. His work has dealt in many areas of population studies, demography, fertility, abortion, family, projections of population growth, aging, and more recently international migration. His current focus, if I say it correctly, is on irregular migration, and which is an issue that is of course very important not only in the US but in many countries and many regions of the world. So without further ado, Joe, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Paul. Pleasure to be here. I'm very pleased to be in Bergen. I've been here before, and it's certainly a lovely city when it's not raining. I've given many talks, especially at the UN, and I'm very relieved that we don't have a gavel here. One of my experiences with speakers, you always run out of time. People want to leave, and there's one speaker, usually the last one, that keeps talking. So on one occasion, he gave him 15 minutes, and he was up to 20. So he passed him some notes, said, "You have 2 minutes, please wrap up." Well, the speaker kept talking. After 3 minutes, he says, "Please stop." Well, he kept talking, and he would not stop. So finally, the chairman raised the gavel, and he was going to gavel them down. So as he raised the gavel, he hit the other speaker sitting next to him in the head and knocked him on the floor. Big commotion, he was bleeding. And he goes down to the fellow on the floor, and he says, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" He says, "Hit me again. I can still hear him talking." So we're going to go quickly today. A lot of slides. There's no gavel. As Jan said, I'm a demographer, and I want to make some things very clear. A demographer is not an accountant without a personality. There's a lot of misconceptions about what a demographer is. Demography is the most exciting subject you can study. It deals with everything: reproduction, sex, family, aging, urbanization, migration, every possible thing of human activity that the great writers like Shakespeare, Plato talked about, deals with demography. It's the most exciting subject. And I think after a presentation, you'll probably be convinced. This is the common slide that you see in many of these talks. Where are the migrants coming? They're going from Africa to Europe. They're going from Europe to Canada, Latin America, Mexico, to the US. But let's go back in time. Our colleague Maurice here says we need a historical perspective. I want to take you back a little bit. 200,000 years ago, at a place right around Eastern Africa, we have the African Eve, 200,000 years ago. That lady and the other Homo sapiens, not the Neanderthals, there's no Neanderthals here, we're all Homo sapiens. We are the offspring of this group right here, all of us. 200,000 years ago. Now, if we take the mean length of a generation to be 25 years, we're the 8,000th generation, all of us, okay? We all migrated. So when you talk about the first generation migrant, second generation migrant, third generation migrant, we're the 8,000th generation migrants. And you people in Norway came a little bit later, 40,000 years ago. And in the Americas, 15,000 years ago, 12,000, even came down here, okay? By, 10,000 years ago, the whole world was populated. It wasn't like the Europeans discovered this empty land. There were people there. They were migrants and their descendants. So people have been migrating ever since Eve kicked Adam out and said, get out. Okay, they've been moving for a variety of reasons, and we'll get into those. So that's the migration part. Now, some demography, and we'll come back to migration in a moment. Next slide. Here are the population milestones. It took all of time from 200,000 years ago to 1840 to reach 1 billion people, okay? By the time of Jesus Christ, there were only about 300 million. It took 1 billion to reach this point. To reach 2 billion, it took another 123 years. Third billion, 33 years in 1960. 4 billion, 1974. 5 billion, 13 years, and yes, 12 years to go from 5 to 6. And in 2 years, 2011, we'll be at 7 billion. And if anyone doubts that, I'm ready to make a wager. Here's the wager. Any number below 7 billion, I'll give you a penny. And any number above the current population of 6.8 billion, you give me a US penny. No one has taken that wager yet. So I'm certain we're going to reach 7 billion. 8 billion is coming around 2025, according to our projections at the UN, and 9 billion around 2044. That's as far as I'll go now. We can talk about long-range projections later. Now, historians may well conclude that the most significant event of the 20th century was what? Was the microwave, wasn't going to the moon, okay? Wasn't pantyhose, wasn't any of these things that people think are so wonderful. It was the growth of world population. During the 20th century, that century was the demographic century. It quadrupled the population, the fastest growth rate, the largest increase, the highest improvements in life expectancy, the most rapid decline in fertility, the most rapid urbanization, flows of people going around the world. The 20th century and the growth of world population is by far the most important thing that happened in the 20th century. It has affected every life form and non-life form on this planet. Here's what's happened in the last 50 years and a little bit to the future. In 1950, the world's population split about 1.5 billion for the developing world, a little under 1 billion, so about a little more than 2.5 billion people in 1950. Today, we're at 6.8 billion. Most of them are in the red, the developing world. These blue is basically Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US. Very little growth. Most of the growth, developing world. Some examples we'll come to in a moment. This graph shows another historic event that happened recently. We finally became an urban world in 2008, we estimate. For centuries, we were rural. Most people lived on the farm. Now I ask you this question. How many of you were born and raised on a farm? Raise your hand. 1, 2. 2 out of this entire room. It demonstrates the world has become urbanized. And that third person, 3 people. Okay, rural area. This is the growth of the least developed countries. These are defined by the UN. These are the poorest countries, largely African, but Bangladesh is in there and Haiti. And their growth is very remarkable. Very, very geometric growth. In contrast, here's Japan. You don't have to look at the numbers to see this very sad trend. Japan is declining and aging now. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's doing it now. Another example, Germany. There's another line here, this light blue. That's Germany without migration. Germany, the medium variant, Germany is going to decline. And these blue and green are high and medium variants. But without migration, the decline in Germany is even more rapid. Russian Federation, similar to Japan, the Russian Federation is now declining. And similarly, it's coming down very rapidly. Another country, Canada. Without migration, Canada's population by 2050 would be about the same size, but older. Canada depends on growth of migration, the growth of its immigrant population to continue growing. Finally, example, the US. US is right now, right about here, about 305 million people. It will exceed, this is a bit outdated, it'll exceed 400 million, and without migration, it'll be around 320. So keep this in mind. Although migrants are a relatively small number, their impact is large. 80% or more of the future growth of the US population is dependent on migration, the immigrants and their descendants. Now some comparisons. In 1950, the blue color here is Europe. They're about 3 times as big as Africa's population in 1950. In the year 2000, they're about the same. But by 2050, Africa's population would be about 2 billion people. And Europe's would be down here at around 600 million. So we have a reversal within 100 years of the ratio between Europe and Africa and Europe being 3 times as large. Now, looking to the future, among the likely most significant events of the 21st century may be the aging of humanity. Okay? Whereas we're going to have more growth, we're going to add a couple billion more people, this aging of humanity is unprecedented. Not everyone has children, but everyone has parents. Aging is affecting every household in the world. This graph here shows you the trend. You see back in the 50s, the majority, 15%, compared to the elderly, 15% were young, under age 5, less than 5% were above 65, and around 2015 they cross, and then the age 65 exceeds under 5 tremendously. We're getting a much older population and its consequences. Let's look at why this has happened. Many people think that we're aging because people are living longer. That's one reason, but the primary reason is the decline in fertility. Let me give you some examples. Algeria, China, Iran, and Vietnam. Very different countries, very different cultures, different religions, different parts of the world. Here's their rates in 65, 70. 7 for Algeria. Any women here have 7 births? None. I didn't think so. I go to talks. There was one man from Alaska. Remember when Governor Palin was running for office? There was one man in the office that had 7 children. And I said, "Are you from Alaska?" He said, "Yes." Okay, so we have 7, 6 for China, almost 7 for Iran and Vietnam. Now, look what happens in one generation. They're all approaching 2. Remarkable. And this is the engine that's causing aging. You shrink the population pyramid at the bottom, you get more people at the top. This is remarkable. Good part of that is because of education and employment of women. You can't simply educate them, you got to put them to work. People know who this woman is? It's a French woman. Our friend Maurice, you know who she is? Yes. Famous French woman. Oldest verified age ever lived. Okay, now women, listen carefully. This applies to you. She was born in 1875 and died in 1997. She lived 122 years and 167 days. You women, if you don't smoke, take care of yourself, have a good relationship with a man or a woman, you can live that long. The men, not so long. It's unfair, but that's the way the biology is. Women outlive men. They have lower mortality, usually at every age. Okay? So, people are living longer and there are fewer children. That's why we have aging. Now we're going to move to migration. This is the graph that we're talking about. In 2010, the number right now exceeds 200,000. Okay? 200 million. And yes, it's a small number, but keep this in mind. These are migrants according to the UN definition, someone that has been abroad more than a year or more. Let me give you an example. In the US, there's about 36 million foreign-born people. 36 million. It's about 13% of the US population. But in 2007, guess how many visitors came into the country? 170 million. So there are many more people moving around that aren't migrants. Enormous number of people moving around. But the migrants, a relatively small proportion. And I have two projections that I've made. By 2050, if it's 3% of the world's population, there'll be 284 million. Or if it's 4%, which I think is going to be closer to 4% of the world's population, we can have 366 million people foreign-born living outside the country of their birth. This graph shows you the movement. They're all regions. They're moving from north to south, south to south, north to north. But the major flows are from the south to the north and from the south to the south. What's driving international migration? Nicola said there were 3 Ds. A bit more detail, these are the same ones. In the countries of origin, rapid population growth. Okay? When you have a country like Kenya, between 1950 and 2000, its population increased 6-fold, from 6 million to about 37 million in 50 years. Rapid population growth, unemployment rates now in the developed countries, 10, 12, 15%. Developing countries, 40, 50%. The living conditions. Many of these countries' living conditions are very difficult. If you have running water, you're lucky. If you have health care, you're even more fortunate. Very difficult, harsh lives. And then finally, you have political, social, ethnic conflict driving people out because it's unsafe, and progress looks very dismal for the future. Now, the countries of destination, they have sub-replacement fertility and population aging. Basically, of the developed countries, the United States is the only country that's at replacement level of about 2.1 children. Virtually all of Europe is below replacement. Okay, there could be exceptions that goes up and down like Albania or Iceland or something, but all of them, like Italy, 1.3, Spain is about 1.2, Eastern Europe, yes, very low. France, doing very well, they're about 1.9. When it went from 1.8 to 1.9, they popped the champagne, everyone was celebrating. Labor shortages. There are labor shortages in many of these countries. If they don't bring migrants, many of the factories will not have as many workers as they would like for optimal. Now, this was the case previous to the economic downturn. It'll probably recover, but there's still labor shortages because of the projected decline. Also, highly skilled brain gain. Many of the countries, almost all the European Union members, even now Japan, the United States, Canada, want the high skilled. We want the brains because they're one of the big ingredients to economic growth in the country. Then finally, the country's destination, we have less costly and improved transportation and communication. So someone sitting in Yemen can get a call from Michigan saying there's jobs in Detroit now, please come. And virtually everyone now, you start seeing cell phones, communication, and they can get there rather quickly. This is a map of Europe. And you see most of Eastern Europe declining. They need migration to continue growing. And the migrants are coming basically from Africa and Asia, and Spain, France, and the UK are growing basically because of the migration. Immigration also affects not only the numbers, but the ethnic composition of the population. This is one example in the US. In the US, in 1970, less than 5% of the population have Hispanic background. Today, it's about 13%. But by 2050, 1/4 of the US population will have Hispanic background. That's why you see people like Obama and McCain and others speaking Spanish. Very few of them are speaking Japanese. This is sign for San Francisco. And this is, we talked about xenophobia. I think they also suffer from schizophrenia. This is one sign that you see. And then you see this sign. So they have a welcome sign, and they say stay out sign. They say they want help wanted, and then they want you to keep out. What this shows is there are different groups in the countries pushing for one type of policy versus another. The private sector, the industrialists, the elites, they want more migrants, cheaper labor, more brains, okay? The public, on the other hand, says we want less immigration, less competition, less stress, less different people. Here's some of the immigration policies over the last 10 years, and you can see that the percentage of countries that want to lower immigration has been going down. It was about 40% in 1996, and now it's less than 20% in 2007. So it's dropped by half, okay? They used to say, we want to restrict immigration. It's coming down. So the common idea is that countries are becoming more restrictive. That isn't borne by the data. And these are the data from the countries' responses to inquiries at the UN. High-skilled workers, the same thing is going on. If you look at the orange, these are the developed countries, okay? 44%, they want to raise and get more high-skilled workers. Now, this is a common scene that you'll see. This is what I call illegal immigration. It's not undocumented, because they have documents. It's illegal immigration. They're trying to come into the country without permission. They have a right to leave their country, but they don't have a right to come in. And these are some Italians here saying, what's going on? So you have risk takers and frustrated officials. This is a very sad situation. This boat here is literally full from top to bottom, mainly men coming from, I think this picture was Libya, with Italians here saying, what are we going to do? Here's a scene, a mob in South Africa attacking a settlement where mainly immigrants from Zimbabwe had been attacked. We talked about walls. This is the American side along the Rio Grande. That's one solution, walls. Here's another wall. This is the fence or the wall, whatever you want to call it, between the Israelis and the West Bank. This is their wall. Here's another wall between India and Bangladesh. Indians are very concerned about Bangladesh coming in, the Bangladeshis. They're saying that so many are coming in, they can't distinguish them from West Bengali, they speak Bengali, that they're affecting the elections in that state. So you think it's sensitive in Europe or in the United States, it's extremely sensitive in India. One more wall, this one you all recognize. So the idea of wall is not a new idea. And it really doesn't work. It keeps some out, but they still get through. Okay, this is the view of immigration by the European public. We're coming to an important point here. We start Ireland, Spain, Austria, Russian Federation, Netherlands. It goes all the way across Hungary, Germany, Italy. And we ask them a question, do you want to increase, maintain, or reduce immigration? Increase, maintain, or reduce. Got it? These are the people that want to increase immigration. And this was a few years ago. Over here, Ireland and Spain. Okay, these are the countries that want to maintain it. Let's just maintain it at the level. Now let's look at the next bar in red. The proportion of the public that wants to reduce immigration. Okay? In virtually every survey, the public wants immigration to be reduced. Here's one scene some of you may have seen in Switzerland. If you're from Italy, I need less than that. They couldn't regulate immigration, and now they live in reservations. Think about it. This is from the Northern League in Italy. So, concluding, what's going to happen? I'm here to tell you. In the 21st century, number one, we're going to have a larger world population. 7 billion by 2011. So if you have children and they're learning the world's population, you can tell them, right now it's 6.8 billion, but in 2 years, we'll have 7 billion. 7 billion. Okay. Most of the growth, 98% of it, is in the developing world. Okay? And in fact, India is the biggest single grower of population. 22% of the growth of the world's population annually comes from India. How many people from the European Union here? Can you raise your hand? Oh, we got a good proportion. Okay, all you people think about this. Take all the European Union and take the growth of the European Union natural increase in 2008. Take your births and subtract the deaths. Simple subtraction. That number for 2008, India achieved in 6 days. Now, if you want to count the migrants that came to Europe, because a lot of them come here, India would need another 12 or 14 days to catch up to that number. So India is growing very rapidly, and most of the developed countries, there's going to be seeing lots of declines as we're seeing in Japan and Russia. Third, we're going to see older populations and people living longer. Now, this isn't a trivial matter, living longer, because it affects your pensions. If you live longer, the governments are going to make you work longer. And that's been happening in many countries, raising the age of retirement. But it's not enough. You're going to raise the age of retirement, you're going to increase the taxes, and you're going to reduce the benefits. And do all three. Fourth, more urbanized, larger cities. Where are the migrants going? They're not going to the rural areas. They're going to cities. Most international migrants want to go to cities. That's where the work is. That's where exciting lifestyles are. That's where they can meet people. That's where they can have economic activity. And finally, we're going to have increased international migration and diversity. Make no mistake about it. Your countries in Europe are going to become more diverse. And you're going to have to learn from the lessons of the Western world, Brazil, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, how to deal with a diverse country. So, what should we do? I added this because people always say, okay, you gave us the facts, now what should we do? Often I give the numbers, the first thing that happens, especially government officials, they say, well, Mr. Shammy, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Look what happened in the economic crisis. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. How do we know about those numbers? So they say, okay, come to my office and we'll show you why we're so confident. So we spend a little bit of time, usually a couple days, and they say, okay, we agree, your numbers seem reasonable. The reason why is the mortality rates are relatively in a fixed range, and births are in a narrow range. People aren't having any more 6, 7, 8 children. Usually in the developed world, it's somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5. In the developing world, it's around 4. So after they agree with the numbers being reasonable, they say, let's do a study. We just study. We've got to get funding for a study, 2-year study. And we bring everyone, you know, the migrants and the natives. We bring women and men, children even, the youth. Bring the disabled. Bring everyone for this committee, a blue ribbon committee. Takes 2 years. Then they do nothing because you have a new government. That old committee worked for the other guys. So they do nothing. What do I suggest? Embrace the future challenges. Don't simply ignore them, embrace them. Here's what's going to likely happen. We're going to have more people, more in the cities, more migrants. They're going to look differently than you. They may pray differently than you. They may have different languages. You have to adjust, embrace. And you need 3 things. First, you need bold vision. Very bold vision. Not for tomorrow, not for 2010, but for 2020, 2030. You need a vision. Where are we going? And someone has to articulate that in a very simple language to the public. This is my vision. This is where I'm going. I remember as a child, John F. Kennedy getting on television and says, we're going to the moon. Before the end of the decade. People laughed. So how are we going to get to the moon? You know, you can't even get to California from New York easily. How do you get to the moon? Anyway, he had a bold vision, and many of the leaders are lacking that today. You need to have vision. Where is Europe going? Is every country going to maintain its own foreign policy about immigrants? Spain, Italy, Greece, Germany, Netherlands, everyone have a different policy? Or are there going to be some kind of policy that's coherent? You have to have some vision. You also need to have strong and enlightened leadership. And as American, I can proudly say that now we have not only strong leadership, but we have enlightened leadership in America. Often you can get a strong leader, but he's not enlightened. He doesn't know the history. Doesn't know the details. You go to a region of the world, he's totally ignorant what's going on, or she. We need to have someone that's enlightened. And then finally, you need resources. You need money, and you need human resources, minds. It's a waste not to educate the young. Every dropout is a dependency from high school, elementary school. You have to educate everyone the best you can. Finally, is demography destiny? My answer? No, it isn't. But, it's way ahead of anything in second place. Thank you very much.
Well, it's 7 o'clock now, so we should close this meeting, but I propose that we extend it for 10 minutes or so, and then, because there is another event hereafter, if you don't mind. So, are there any questions, first of all, to Dr. Chamey? Over there, please. So please tell us who you are and keep your question as brief as possible.
Okay, thanks. My name is Matlotleng Matlo from South Africa. If migration from the developing world is largely driven by the factors that you gave, I don't see in terms of what we should do, unless it's subsumed there, that we should create conditions for development. We should deal with the issues of conflict in order that people have benefits at home, so that they don't get into the kind of mental health problems that the previous speaker was talking about, in the countries that they go to. Your response to that?
Short answer, absolutely. In the Cairo conference, one of the recommendations says we should try to make it possible so a person can stay in the country of their birth and remain there and not be forced to migrate. We need to develop the countries. We need to develop these countries and make them a place where people can find employment, find opportunities, and reduce the conflict. However, that requires international cooperation. And for the last 8 years or so, it's been very difficult to get the developed world on the same page with regard to cooperation. We can't have countries that are abusing their citizens and creating these waves of refugees, and then we start talking about human rights for migrants. We have to look at the source where these are occurring. We have to assist these countries in their development. It's to everyone's advantage. We don't need more failed states. We need to have these countries develop, and that's going to be one of the ways of reducing this outflow. There'll continue to be migration. As I mentioned, it started in Africa. It's been going on for 200,000 years. It's not going to stop. But if you can have people say, I'm staying in Malaysia, I'm staying in Indonesia, I'm staying in South Africa, I'm staying in Ireland, I'm not leaving because I can work here, that's the goal.
Any other question? If you have questions to the other members of the panel, those are welcome too. So please. Yeah.
My name is Parvin Qureshi. I'm from Canada. I'm really convinced that demography is something everybody should know. But as you said, it's not just a question of failed state, but all the Western countries are competing and sending, and they want all these skilled people, men, women, whatever, to come. So my question in terms of what to do you have any example of, yes, there should be leadership, bold vision, and all the, among all of these countries that you're looking at, is there any example where they're doing something where other people could use as a model? Relatively, not the best model.
Okay, thanks.
I think Canada is a good model.
Well, in Canada, we debate that.
Yeah.
Any other
Well, if you look at the surveys and you compare the United States to Canada, the Americans think unauthorized or illegal migration is a problem. We have to do something with the migrants. The Canadians don't see that at all. They don't have illegal migration as a problem. The Canadian example is the example where they've tried to integrate the groups, try to bring them in, try to make them Canadians, maintain their culture, and move forward. The difficulty I see with Europe is, one, they forget, they sometimes suffer from amnesia, that they too came from Africa. It's just depending on what generation they're in, okay? They came from somewhere else. They're not mushrooms that grew up in the cave spontaneously and all of a sudden populated these countries. So that mindset has to change. And second, if these flows are coming, you have to be consistent and just. You cannot tell people, if you come in illegally, we're going to send you back, and then 2 years go by and you don't send them back. You have to have laws and rules that are consistent. And you have to have a message that's clear. Now, I know the European Union is working with African countries to try to keep the youth in Africa. But you can't simply say, don't go, stay here. They're all going to leave if there's no employment. There's no exciting lifestyle. There's no health. There's no future. So they're going to have to spend some time developing those countries in the origin countries. In the destination countries, as I said, we have many examples where we brought in a lot of different people. And if anyone reads the historical literature, the treatment of the Irish in America was worse than the treatment of the Mexicans in America today. Okay? The way the Italians were received in the US, in some ways, is very similar to the way the Mexicans and some of the Caribbeans are being treated in the US today. But the US has a way of somehow homogenizing people. You retain your culture, you retain your identity, and you become American. Now, there are going to be a lot of debates about this. We have the French example, we have the Dutch example, we have multiculturalism, we have assimilation, we have integration. This debate has to go on, and the more that we have the debate in Brussels and throughout the countries that we're saying discussion, the better the people are going to be able to digest it. But if you look at the public attitudes, the public really doesn't want more immigration. And the government has to address that, or you have the rise of right-wing political parties.
Well, but it took the Irish 5 to 6 generations to assimilate, whereas the current politicians, certainly in Europe, are extremely impatient. They want to have assimilation now, not later than tonight. So there were 2 individuals over there, 3 perhaps 2, and so there's 1, 2, and then that's you, and then we need to call it a day. Oh, sorry, it's you. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sanjay Hazarika. And actually, both Imtiaz and I are going to, he's from Bangladesh, I'm from India. We're going to toss a few questions out.
You sat together.
We work together. One is, I'm glad you touched on this because it didn't come out in the earlier presentation, the extreme political hostility, even in South Asia, in the South, to migration from a neighboring country. Add to that the securitization of the debate. You know, radical Islamic elements are coming in, there's a whole Talibanization thing. And I think that's very extremely important to look at because that really hasn't come into the discussion today at all. And
Relate your question, please. Very, very.
No,
concise.
that's a comment.
Yeah,
That's a
and now
comment.
the
That hasn't.
question-
And the second comment is nobody in these 3 presentations has talked about trafficking. And that's largely women and children from Nepal, Bangladesh, and Burma.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I'm Imtiaz from Bangladesh. I want to roll back to Nicola's presentation, actually. And she talks about migration development nexus, and all 3 speakers, I think, missed something, and that's what I call in migration of ideas, because for the first time, we have so many South Asians living in the Middle East, and that has transformed in the context of ideas, because you do end up getting more rigid, and if I talk within the Islamic domain, you do get a very rigid version of Islam coming from the Middle East and reproducing militancy. And added to that is, I see Nicola presenting feminization of work, migration, and poverty, but there's also a feminization of militancy. And Pakistan would be a good example of that, and so would be India and Bangladesh. The figures that you have pointed out in 1960 and 2002 with South Asians remaining similar, also I think makes the point, and this is what Sanjay I think was addressing, the illicit women trafficking, because if you add that, then the women, that goes, that goes up. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, then there's the. Yeah.
I want to make it clear to you.
Please be brief.
Yeah. Migration has positive and negative consequences. The Europeans in 1492 started going to the Western Hemisphere, and because of their visit with guns and microbes, they killed 90% of the inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere. 90% of the people living in the Western Hemisphere were killed off basically because of the Europeans coming over with their guns, with their swords, and with diseases, smallpox and other microbes. Now, there has been exchange. The Indians gave them corn, gave them tomatoes. There has been an exchange of ideas and cultures, and there have been many, many gains. And I tell the Europeans, if you don't want the ideas coming in, then go back to Roman numerals. Don't use Arabic numerals when you do your arithmetic.
Okay, thanks. You have a very quick question? Say a 10-second question, would that be possible?
Slides, there was a word communication. And you referred to communication into interpersonal communication between families within the same community. But what was missing and in all this presentation is communication in terms of public broadcasting, because people are influenced by ideas that come through television and which are very often false. This creates unjustified expectations for many, and then they fall victims in many cases. And I think that now, what can be done about it? Nothing. The communication, the television, the public media will do their thing and probably will continue creating this false impression, which in fact impact on a migration.
Is there any of the members of the panel who wants to respond to that? Because it's a comment more. Okay, then we call it a day. It's 7:10. Paul, you have some concluding comments?
Well, I basically wanted to thank the three speakers for their well-balanced and often entertaining presentation. It's also a moment to thank our sponsors, which are NWO from the Netherlands, the North Face program and the COST program of the European Union, I think that is. Not to forget the impeccable organization here locally in Norway. Finally, thank you for the audience, for your patience, your interest and your participation, your active participation, and my co-chair as well. And migration is an issue, is here to stay for social sciences, and I think that's a very strong conclusion. Apart from that, thank you also, Joseph, to bring in some passion in demography. I think we need that. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you.